Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for stopping by. Today, I bring you a short compilation of works with one of the best and most underrated horror channels on YouTube. Please be sure to check out the incredibly talented Duchess Stark when you're done. I know you'll enjoy her work just as much as I do. So without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the Duchess take control.
Last year, a friend and I went on a long road trip to New Mexico. We camped most of the way, and our first night we got to camp, we spent in the Jefferson National Forest at a campsite in West Virginia. We had found some pamphlets for campsites at a gas station, and we drove out to a place called White Rocks Campground, which was like a 25-plus mile up a dirt road into the mountains. We were in the boonies. On our way in, we saw no cars, except for one truck that was behind us for maybe 15 minutes, but then turned down another road. We passed a huge coal factory with a sign that had said 62 days since an on-site incident. The only people we saw on our drive were standing on the side of the dirt road, huddled around a plastic bin that was on fire. It was all so odd, but we were so excited about camping and being on this trip, we were just laughing about how weird it was, instead of not being worried about having no cell phone reception or being so deep into the mountains. We finally get to the campground, and it's completely empty. Not a single car or person to be seen, and the campground had about 30 sites. We drove around all of them trying to spot anyone, but when we realized it was just us, we picked a random site and decided to just stick it out. We got out of the car and stood there and just listened. The silence was startling. I love being in the woods. I've never felt scared or intimidated to be out there, but there was such a different feeling this time. There were no bird sounds. It was just thick, silent woods. It was getting dark quick, and we decided to start a fire and put up the tent, try to get comfortable. My friend was in charge of the tent, and I was putting together the fire. While we were trying to go about our business, we would both just stop and listen. My friend even made the point that if anyone was to approach us, at least there were crunchy leaves everywhere for us to hear it coming. It felt like someone was watching us. It was the first time in my life I've understood what that feeling is. I had goosebumps. I wanted to leave, but I kept my cool for my friend. The fire is started. The tent is up, and the sleeping bags are ready. The sun was set. Sitting around the fire together, the darkness seemed to close in on us now. It felt suffocating. My friend brought out a book to read aloud and made us feel more comfortable. While she was reading, I grabbed my headlamp and would occasionally turn it on and look around me. I had the feeling since we pulled into the campsite that someone was there in the woods. Pitch black, and our fire was a beacon. We decided to go to sleep, but that we would pack up early in the morning and get the fuck out of here. We put out the fire, and I decided to grab the one knife we had on us that was still in the car, and kept it beside me in the tent. After getting into our sleeping bags, my friend pulls out her cell phone to see if she had any reception. Nothing. She tried to dial her boyfriend just in case, and I remember saying out loud, "We have no reception out here, it won't work." We laid there in the silence, repeatedly watching her phone trying to dial out. and then disconnect. Suddenly, about 20 feet off to the left of our tent, footsteps. These weren't footsteps that quietly built up. These were footsteps like someone had been standing behind the tree near our tent and started walking toward us. The crunchy leaves were doing their job. We froze. We just stared at each other, eyes wide. The footsteps continued to walk toward the tent, then turned to go behind for maybe a couple yards, and then stopped. Silence again. Heavy, booted footsteps with the same pattern that would be a person walking, not a bear or a deer. My friend grabbed my knife that was laying by my bag and grabbed her headlamp. Unzips the tent and gets out and stands in front of the tent, knife out, looking around the area. She's a goddamn warrior. It was maybe 45 seconds of silence as we listened for more footsteps or voices. And I could see the light from my friend's headlamp dashing around the trees, but there was nothing there. At this point, she stuck her head back in the tent and said, "We're getting the fuck out of here." We then proceeded to, in record time, pack up everything, and in 10 minutes we were out of there. I'm amazed about it, thinking back on it, how we didn't lose our heads, keeping our cool while we packed, but internally screaming in terror. We only had our headlamps on, and the whole time we were packing up, I kept thinking about how the hill people would grab us and pull us into the darkness, and we would be completely helpless if they did. It didn't feel like it was really happening. Maybe that's why we were almost completely calm while packing. There's no way this is actually happening on our first night camping. We must just be freaking ourselves out. But I still felt like we were being watched. We sped out of there once done. Now here is where the hill people hunting us was confirmed. As we pulled out of the campsite, there were 2 black, dirty trucks pulled off to the side of the road, hidden in the trees, but almost still completely visible. They had definitely not been there when we pulled in earlier, and the closest residential homes were 15 miles away. We didn't see anyone around them, but we didn't stop to look either. We ended up finding a motel and staying the night there, and we proceeded to tell the owner the entire story, who was amazingly sweet and comforting. I will remember every detail of that night for the rest of my life. The feeling like we were being watched, hearing the footsteps so closely, so suddenly, and the black trucks of the people who were hunting us. My mom used to be an RN at a hospital in a small western town. The hospital was connected to a senior living home, and at night, the RN on duty overwatched both sides of the building. She was usually the overnight RN, and would have either 1 or 2 CNAs working with her as well. She has experienced this apparition about 6 or 7 times during her 10-year stint there, and everyone has referred to the apparition as the Man in Black. Each experience was identical, except for the location in the building. Frequently during the night, she would have to do her rounds, checking vitals, etc., and would have to walk around a corner from the nurse's station toward the 6 beds in the hospital and toward the senior home. She would see the apparition either right after rounding the corner or right after walking out of a room and walking to the next. Outside of the next room, she would see the apparition. The apparition was of the same person in black, old Western-style suit with worn black cowboy boots, worn black cowboy hat to match. The creepiest thing about this man was that he had no distinct face. She described it as though a man's face was drawn with charcoal and slightly smeared, slightly blurred. He had to have been about 6'5", and would tower over her 5'5" frame. But whenever she would see him, it could be 10 feet away or 3 feet away, he would just stand there looking at her, and then turn and walk into the room he was outside of. When she would walk into that room, there would not be any other person in there or anything out of place. The first few times scared her to a panic, but she slowly just went on without letting it freak her out. But with this man came some extra attention to that patient. The kicker was that in about 90% of all the experiences seen by other RNs as well, the patient's health would deteriorate in the next few days, and the patient most often passed away shortly after. So whenever the overnight RNs saw the man in black, extra precautions would be taken with that patient. Another weird thing about the apparition is that it always seemed to be seen by just the RN. Not a single CNA has personally seen the apparition. My mother always said that he knew who would be able to help the most at the time. I, on the other hand, took it as completely the opposite. I always thought that it was almost to mock the RNs because he was letting them know that something was about to happen and that they couldn't do anything about it. Even though I'm not an RN, it still creeps me out every time I walk down the hall, and she points out where she has seen him. Last summer, I road tripped across the U.S. solo for 2 months. I left Crater Lake in Prospect, Oregon, heading to California later than I'd planned, and I was looking to camp anywhere I could find. My gas light had been on for 30 miles, and there hadn't been any gas stations, so I was getting a little nervous. I finally saw a sign for a campground, and I figured I could talk to whoever was camping there to find out how far away a gas station was, and maybe sleep there for the night. It was an old logging site, so the road there was very rough and very far from the main road. I pulled in, and there was a mid to late 20s couple at the very first site. I said hello and asked them if they knew the area. I got a sense of genuine friendliness from them. They said the nearest gas station was only 2 miles away, but that it was closed for the night. The site next to them was open, and they suggested that I take it. I started setting up my tent and was using a rock to get my stakes in the ground when the guy showed up with his hand axe and offered to help. Creepy, but helpful. I asked if he drank and offered him a beer as a neighborly gesture. His wife/girlfriend came over and asked if I had any pills. Just some ibuprofen. But why don't you have some weed I picked up in Washington? They reminded me to pay for my site at the self-serve box. More than once. Red flag. So I said I didn't have any cash. They said I could just write my credit card information down and put it in the box. 1,000 red flags. The woman wanted to introduce me to the neighbors, so she took me to an RV that looked like it had been parked there for multiple months. Cardboard over the wheels, dirty. Inside, a very drunk man, somewhere over 60. A woman who insisted on feeding me the tacos she was cooking, and a dog looking at me like maybe I had food in my pockets. The drunk man started a very long story that wound up being a joke, with the punchline being Jeffrey Dahmer cannibalism based. And at the moment, the woman handed me a taco. I said I had to check on something, got the fuck out of the trailer, tossed the taco to the dog following me, and proceeded to crack open a beer to put together a plan. These people were messed up, but I didn't feel like I was in any immediate danger. I decided to shoot the breeze with the guy from the first couple, and the way he described it, they'd been camping for 2 weeks because money ran out. Pretty soon I heard the old woman yelling at the man, "That's it, I've had it." I had stated that I was thinking about heading over to the gas station to see if it was actually closed, just so I could get a few more miles in for the day. Old lady comes over to where Dude and I are standing and says, "He's really done it this time. Next ride into town that comes my way, I'm gonna take it." I sip my beer. Younger woman says to me, "I can ride with you to the gas station, just so you find it." I take a much larger sip of my beer. I'm starting to get really uncomfortable. I make up some shit excuse to go back to my site, rip up my tarp, tent, and fly all together, shove it in the back of my car, and got the fuck out of there. Made it to the gas station, which was indeed closed, but passed a charming B&B less than a mile before. I explained to the desk clerk that I had a very weird encounter at a campsite and I would be sleeping in my car in their lot that night. She wanted to sell me a room I couldn't afford, but wound up offering the use of their bathroom and morning coffee. Filled up my tank in the morning and bid farewell to Prospect, Oregon. The very small step-down unit I worked in was having nighttime staffing issues. I agreed to rotate to nights to help them out. It was a 4-bed, newly renovated unit. It was around 3 a.m., and I was watching the monitors, listening to the patients snore. The pencil drawer slid open. I didn't think much of it, since the hospital was on a very busy avenue, and I thought it was caused by the vibrations from the traffic on the busy road below. After sliding the drawer back several times, I decided if the drawer felt it needed to be open, so be it. Several minutes later, I heard a noise in the room. The patient's bathroom door opening and the sound of someone pushing an IV pole. Since I did not have a clear view of the bathroom, I just thought one of the staff members from the main floor had dashed in to wash their hands. I looked up from my monitor viewing to see a patient we recently had in the unit. We'll call her Mrs. G. An older woman who came in with an atypical chest pain, became septic due to a gallbladder issue. She evidently had expired in the unit. Although the hospital itself had been on site for years, this unit was newly renovated, right down to tearing down the walls and putting up new ones. I heard the patient's bathroom door open, and again I heard the rattling of an IV pole and the shuffling of feet. I looked up and saw Mrs. G standing there in the middle of the floor, one hand pushing the IV pole, and the other hand on top of the pump on the pole. She stopped walking, turned, and waved, nodded her head, said everything was going to be okay, took a few steps, and disappeared. Shortly after that vision, one of the nurses from the floor came to see if I needed anything. I told her I was okay, and asked her if she had ever seen a ghost in the hospital. She looked at me, gasped, and asked, "No, why?" I explained to her what had just happened. She said she would never step foot in that room again. Mrs. G was the first patient to die in that unit. She was well liked by all the staff, and my feeling was that she was just watching over us. The day shift came in and I told them my story. They weren't surprised. Through the years, working at various hospitals, I had worked as a nurse extern my senior year in nursing school, and I had heard older nurses telling their stories about ghosts. I thought they were just burnt out. Yes, there are ghosts in care facilities. If they're not seen, their presence is felt. They leave behind an energy, and it's always all around you. Camping out last fall in the Allegheny National Forest. The missus and I, 2 dogs, in a primitive site about 100 yards away from the road. It was very late in the season, so we were literally the only people for miles. Our campsite was set up with 2 tents facing each other across the fire pit. We slept in one with the dogs, and the other we used for storage. The second night, like an idiot, I decided to leave the sealed food in the storage tent instead of tying it up or taking it to the car for the night. I awoke at 2 a.m. to the sound of ripping and crunching. Jerked completely awake, mind racing, I knew instantly that something was in the storage tent, nomming on some tasty dog food or potato chips. I fumbled for a flashlight and slowly unzipped my tent's fly. Shined the light across the campsite to the other tent. That's when I saw a pair of eyes. I was expecting a raccoon. The problem was that the eyes were about 2 to 3 feet off of the ground. Black bear. Big one. I know intellectually that you're supposed to make noise. I know intellectually that I'm not in much danger. However, being within a few feet of a bear, at night, in the pitch black, not being able to see a thing, but the sounds, the ripping, the heavy tread, the snuffling, it's truly, primally terrifying. Higher thought processes went right out the window. I zipped my tent back up and looked down at my wife. Grabbed my axe and stood over her sleeping body in the tent in a defensive position in case he tried to get into the sleeping tent. I stood like that for half an hour in complete darkness, just listening to the breathing and the hurrfing and the ripping and the eating. A black bear eating potato chips at night is very loud. He wandered around the site, even snuffling at the outside of our tent. I never woke up the wife, because why subject her to this terror, I thought. Eventually, higher thought processes started to leak through. The car was 50 yards away. Maybe I could run to it. Maybe I should make a noise. Maybe it will go away. What was I thinking? The car. My keys were by my sleeping bag, and on those keys, oh, those glorious keys, was the electronic fob. And on that heaven-sent electronic fob was the button we all think is useless and annoying if you accidentally press it. That glorious alarm button. I smashed down that button, and the night lit up with honks and flashing lights. Sound and light crashed through the campsite, and I heard the bear take off. That's when my wife woke up, to see her shaking, pale-faced husband standing over her with an axe. After I calmed her down, we got out and inspected the campsite. The bear had ripped its way into the storage tent and had eaten potato chips, dog food, trail mix. It had wandered around to our side to the dishwashing area, probably attracted to the smell of the dirty dishwater with meat residue in it. Still coming down from my adrenaline rush, the wife and I spent the rest of the night sleeping in the car. The bear never came back, and I learned my lesson regarding food at a campsite. And the whole time, the motherfucking dogs never woke up. Hey guys, Duchess Stark here, and thank you so much for listening. Oh, were you expecting Mort? Sorry, he's over on my channel. Shouldn't you be there too? Click the link on the screen now, or in the description box to follow us over. Don't keep me waiting.